Hello and welcome to this episode of The Print Mind Over Matter. Most of us don't even like to accept that there is something called climate change happening. Maybe abhi kyunki G20 ke posters har jagah hai, maybe that's why we are forced to sort of accept that, oh, there is something called climate change and global warming happening. A lot of us also like to believe that global warming bahar west mein ho raha hai, India mein nahi ho raha hai. But we all have been experiencing, extreme temperature change. We keep asking, for example, in Delhi, we keep asking, how is it that it's raining in May? So these are examples of climate change. But again, you might be wondering that in an episode of mental wellness, why have I brought in climate change? So this is something that Raj actually here will tell us more about, because there is a relationship, there is given to between climate change and mental wellness. But I'm not the expert, so let the expert tell us that. Could you tell us what's the relationship between climate change and mental wellness, and when did this topic or research area begin to be investigated? Because I don't think it's very old, right?
Absolutely right. And I'm actually going to latch on to the first bit of what you said, is that quite a few of us don't think that climate change exists. Now, I think conversation around climate change has started happening in the last 3 to 4 years internationally, and similarly so for mental health, right? So let's pick apart why. It's not the fact that extreme weather events haven't been happening in the last 20 years. You ask most people in Bangladesh, you ask someone in Odisha, you ask someone in West Bengal or Assam, they've been happening for years. And people have been living through disasters, through droughts for the last 20 years at least. But I think we're finally sitting up and taking notice because it's happening, as you said, in Bombay, Delhi, New York and Western Europe. Now similarly so with mental health. We finally sat up and took notice only around COVID, and that's because everyone was suffering. So that immediately tells us something about both mental health and climate change, is that everything that we see out there, the research, the narratives, they are all from privileged positions, right? So what's the link between mental health and climate change? The clearest link is the fact that those who are the most marginalized are deeply affected by both climate change and mental health, which means that those who come from rural communities, from occupations that practice primary resource sectors such as fishing, farming, those who come from oppressed castes and races, LGBTQIA persons, are all deeply affected by climate change, but are also all deeply affected by mental health. Now, low and middle income countries face the major brunt of climate change. But the other link is 80% of the world's people who live with a mental health condition all live in LMICs, right? So it's very important that these two fields talk to each other, but as you rightly said, there has been very little talk, and whatever little talk there has been, it has been from the position of the West, which means when we talk about climate change and mental health, we are hearing about terms such as climate anxiety or solastalgia, or even seasonal affectiveness disorder. Now these are all very Eurocentric terms, but if I have to take a look at India, I know that 60,000 farmers and those who work in the farming sector have died by suicide over the last 3 decades. Part of this is related to climate effects. So I think the link for us sitting here, it's very important to say both mental health and climate change are very important parts of conversations around development, and we cannot very easily separate them from other development issues such as poverty, such as homelessness, such as livelihood issues, and of course in India also gender-based violence, and I think overall multi-dimensional poverty, right? So we know that farmers are affected. We know that children's education is interrupted in schools in Assam when there are droughts, landslides, floods. We know that migrant workers, which you saw during COVID, the troubles that migrant workers faced. Now, they are in an interesting position, and I'm going to use examples to illustrate what I'm talking about. Migrants are likely to be forced into migrating to cities for livelihood, for a better life. Now, the moment they reach cities, the sorts of settlements that they are able to find to stay in cities are settlements that are more vulnerable to climate change. So, again, using an example of a community, a migrant community in Bombay, they had to set up homes in an area that faces landslides. The government decided to put up a retaining wall to help with these landslides. Now, retaining walls have been shown not to really work. One fine monsoon about 3 years ago, the retaining wall came crumbling down due to rains. People died, there was debris all over, people's houses were destroyed. 2 years on, not even the debris has been removed, and the community is still kind of struggling to get back on its feet. So, in terms of just pure research and numbers, what it shows is that disasters can have a major effect on people's lives, obviously from the mental health aspect, and by this I mean people suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and these are all conditions that I'm talking about. But more importantly, there was a large-scale study done across 80 countries where about 25% of people said that even if a disaster happened 3 to 4 years ago, they were still struggling to carry out daily life because of it. And what does it mean then for someone who is a migrant who may not have been able to go to work then for the next 15 days to earn a living? If their house has come crumbling down, they've managed to put it back up, yet when you hear the sound of raindrops on a tin roof, it really triggers anxiety, it triggers fear, and you're unable to sleep because every moment you're thinking, what if I have to run out of the house? Right? And so I actually want to steer away from these ideas of PTSD, depression, anxiety, simply because the moment I bring in conditions and mental health, it leaves me with only two solutions. One is talk therapy and the second one is psychiatric medication. Now, is that appropriate? Is that accessible? For the people who are most affected by climate change and mental health implications both? Partly the answers may be proper shelter, partly the answers will come in livelihood access or in stable employment. Of course, it does not mean that talk therapy should not be accessible, but it has to be a part and parcel of things that are provided to those who are most affected. I wonder whether that was a very long answer to your question, but
yeah, no, but it basically sums up what was the general concern. And like I said, it's not a topic that's often discussed. Even for me, trying to even research for this interview was a struggle because, again, I was very difficult to find, even basic resources that talk about this. So
absolutely.
I was actually thinking, yes, that if I consider myself, and I am privileged in that sense that, okay, I have access to certain resources. If I can't even find a resource that, for an interview, then I imagine what people going through would. So
absolutely.
I want to bring in the next point, which is something probably is a question that comes from personal experiences. For example, living in Delhi for 13 years now, I'm not from here. So every time it would be extreme temperatures in winter, I realized, and it was much later that I realized like this is an actual issue. Because I kept thinking it's just the cold, it's just the cold. So every time there would be days without the sun, I realized, it's not a usual gloomy and saying that, oh, there's no sun, but it really, get to me in a certain way. So I was wondering now that I see a lot of people happy that they don't have to pay AC bills, and I keep saying that to myself too. But there's also a lot of people who are like, but this is not normal, this is, and when they say not normal, they don't really mean necessarily the climate change because we're still yet to accept it. But I guess they're also talking about how, you align yourself in certain ways in your daily lives and in your mental makeup about, oh, this is going to be summer. These are the things that should be happening. It's like feeling a bit lost about this whole thing. So I wanted to talk about how these changes, which may not be in the form of disasters maybe. But like these changes that are definitely happening, the days getting very hot or very cold, and then your body obviously is immediately getting affected because, the physical, the moment the physical is, of course, your mental wellness is also coming into play. So could you tell us?
Yeah, so, of course, the acute disasters, acute weather events are all there, but there are also climate change also means more subtler changes in weather patterns and such, as you said. And that does obviously have an effect. So, again, I think easiest for me to illustrate using an example. Now, Delhi is enjoying the weather largely, but for example, in Bombay and in Bangalore, there's been a heat wave.
Right.
Right? So, it's always interesting to me when we talk about workplace mental health. Again, the idea is we are talking about people like us in these offices, in these AC offices insulated from the weather, right? But currently, Bangalore and Bombay are undergoing a heat wave. Now, there are sanitation workers called parikramas in Bangalore, and they typically tend to be women from a Dalit background. They are out and about from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. They don't have access to water as part of their job.
Okay.
And what does that then do to your mental health, especially when you are underpaid? You may not have protective gear to do the work that you're doing, which is hazardous work, and then you have this heat wave. They're forced to buy 10 to 20 rupee bottles of water. Conversely, in Bombay, what happened with the police force is they allowed policemen over a certain age to take half days because of the heat. And what research has shown again, there's very limited research in India to do with occupational heat stress. But looking at studies from Thailand, there is a very clear link between mental health and heat at work. And what they found is most workers who do work outside, who work in informal labor, who may be working in manufacturing, faced heat stress even before they got to work because travel. Once they did get to work, they saw linkages between irritability, stress, emotional distress, which then in certain jobs actually led to physical safety issues, because there is irritability and confusion that comes from that. So you're absolutely right when you say even the subtle changes can have an effect, and studies elsewhere and abroad have shown that summertime heat or rising temperatures, even when they rise 1 to 2 degrees above normal, have a correlation between self-harm and suicide. And these were studies done in USA and Mexico as well as other parts of Europe. But again, these are linkages that are cropping up quite often. Nighttime heat is associated with self-harm, for example. And of course, sleeplessness due to heat in itself results in mental health distress. So even the subtle links, as you said, and you said that winters can be bleak and you feel this kind of seasonal pattern. Again, the West has a name for it. It's called seasonal affectiveness disorder or depression. Now, I think there's a lot of back and forth between experts on this topic. And experts have shown that some people face it in the summers as well. People who don't like the heat, people who don't like to go out and picnic and that type of thing, which is typically what happens in the West. So I wouldn't be surprised if one of the triggers for certain types of distress is the weather. Of course, in India, putting like a name to it, having a diagnosis to it would be virtually pointless, because even the most privileged of us all don't have the easiest time accessing appropriate mental health.
So because you mentioned this particular community and the women, so I was wondering, is there like within obviously the class, caste, race, gender system, I mean we know there are more, but is there a way of knowing like that there is this group that ends up getting the worst of the situation? Because either, I mean, and I don't mean disaster, for example, they have been happening a lot. I mean, look at Joshimath, for example, what happened, like suddenly you have a house and you don't, and you've explained it, right? Like if I wake up and I've grown up in Assam, so I know about earthquakes. Like it was such a default setting in our head that even when going to school, I remember there was this one prediction of earthquake. Now the predictions with earthquake is you never know it will actually happen.
Absolutely.
So the easiest solution is the parents would not send their kids to school.
Right.
So it's missing out on school days, of course.
Yes.
And then the rest of us who went, because the school authorities also don't want to take responsibility, let's say 300-400 kids, because that's
Absolutely.
what happens in public
Yes.
schooling, right?
Yes.
So we spent half the day where we were doing like these earthquake drills, right, where you've been taken
Right.
out and all of it. And I remember like it became such a default for me that when every time something happened in Delhi, it was such an automatic response to do things, or
Right.
it was such a dismissal that this is not as bad as back home.
Yes.
That I wouldn't be bothered. And a lot of people asked why. I said because we have had it worse. So
Yes.
this minor thing doesn't really bother me.
Affect.
But I also know that every time there's a news of an earthquake back home, every time I pick up my phone, there's a severe anxiety that I can experience because I'm calling my parents and I'm not very sure what I'm going to hear at the other end.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I was just generally wondering, like, is there a way to understand or gauge, or if we are going to do anything about, okay, who is going to get the most affected that way? Because like you said, even in AC rooms, it's not like we have like the best. It's the best of the best who get to those AC
Absolutely.
insulated offices,
Absolutely.
right?
Yes. So, like I said, there are due to certain marginalizations, you are uniquely vulnerable to both mental health stressors and climate change, right?
Right.
And I mentioned marginalized caste. Similar to marginalized caste are, say, for example, queer trans communities. Now, people who may have moved from smaller towns or villages to live their life as themselves. Again, where are they going to move to in cities, and do they have any type of family networks, right? It's likely again going to be unstable housing. The moment something happens, or in that case, if you don't have well ventilated housing, again, you're more uniquely vulnerable to weather. But again, if there's a disaster, and we saw this happen there was a tsunami in Tamil Nadu. The Aravani community, which is a traditional trans community in Tamil Nadu, post that tsunami, they were actually unable to access any of the government shelters.
Okay.
And what happens then when you have no family to go back to and you don't have the government shelter, right? What are you going to do then? Second, due to lack of identification, because if you are trans, getting identification is hard. You don't get any of the rehabilitation, you don't get any of the relief food, no nothing. And actually Dalit communities also face the exact same thing, by the way. Unable to get into shelters, not getting the relief despite having ID. And this has been documented actually fairly well in terms of Dalit communities. Similarly, so for persons with disability, which is the largest minority in the world. Okay, in India that number is about 3 crores. Persons with disability also left out because for quite a few persons with disability, none of the bathrooms are accessible in shelters when there's a disaster. Add to that, for persons with disability, then the shame and the stigma of having to ask other people who are suffering for help.
Right.
And then I think the third kicker, which is climate change events such as disasters, cause disability in and of themselves. So after the cyclone Amphan, actually, there were very large numbers of persons and children with intellectual and other disabilities that were actually completely abandoned by their caregivers out of compulsion, out of not having a choice. Right, so you can see where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
Is that communities that are already vulnerable actually face the brunt of both things. Because there's also lack of affirmative health care, especially say if I look at LGBTQI communities, right? Whether it's mental health or actual physical health care. And even, workers who are working in informal settings with heat waves. What we did find, or what research has found, is that when there are heat waves and you work in not well ventilated, not well, I guess, organized sectors, and there is a heat wave, if you have a mental illness, the risk of your mortality actually triples due to that heat wave. So there are quite a few communities, but the key is, again, these are the communities that are the most affected, and the reason that we need to look at this carefully is if we design both our mental health systems and our climate response systems in a way that makes sure that all these communities are covered, we will be covering everyone.
Right.
Okay, safe shelters also means that any woman who's in the shelter, she could be a trans woman, she could be a disabled woman, or she could be a heterosexual woman, right? If I have safe shelters where women are okay going into bathrooms, because I know, again, well documented, that women were unable to go to the bathroom safely in shelters, right? So what types of systems changes do we have to make so that natural hazards have always existed, remain just natural hazards and don't turn into disasters. There's a reason that the USA is only now grappling with it. Otherwise, they also face different types of extreme weather situations, but their systems have been able to keep up to this point, roughly.
Right. I think this was probably one of the most insightful conversations I've had so far, because again, it's a topic that we don't really discuss. And thank you actually, Raj, for giving such detailed answers to my queries, because honestly, like I think as much as I tried to read up, I don't think I had as much idea or you know, a general approach to what India in particular would be, you know, looking at in terms of mental. And like I said, you know, when you pointed out, I think I could relate to it immediately, because like I said, I'm from a place that sees
Exactly.
floods every year, that sees earthquakes every year. And you can see the distress not just playing out in front of you, but also in people you know. So I think, and I'm hoping, at least if nothing else, this conversation helps you to remember that climate change is very real, and it is not happening out there somewhere where it cannot touch you or affect you. It's happening on an everyday basis, and it is something that can deeply impact your mental wellness. If you have suggestions for topics that we should cover in this series, please do leave that in our comment section. Thank you for watching this.